bomb on Iran. They haven't nuked Syria. They haven't nuked anybody. They haven't even expanded their land territory. They literally removed Jews from Gaza and gave it to the Muslims, the terrorists. And all that money, instead of them building a freaking Four Seasons on the Mediterranean, they decide to build tunnels for terrorism. What in the are we talking about? The religion of conquest is Islam. All of these nations around Israel used to be Christian nations, used to be other Arab nations that didn't involve radical Islam. But what do? Now they're all Islamic states by force, by genocide. What are we saying? You can't find a terrorist attack from a Jew. All you see is terrorism from Muslims. And I'm not saying every Muslim falls in that category, but I'm saying Islamists and all of these radicalized Muslims are the ones that are the problem in the world. You don't see Christians doing this. You don't see Buddhists doing this. You don't see Mormons doing this. You don't see Catholics doing this. You don't see nobody doing this but Muslims.
Christian extremist group based in the United States, known for its violent anti-abortion stance. Emerging in the 1980s, it claims to operate under divine authority, believing that killing abortion providers is not only justified, but commanded by God. The group interprets biblical scripture to support what it calls a defensive action against abortion, equating the procedure to murder and those who perform it to mass killers. Members view themselves as soldiers in a holy war to protect unborn children, often invoking Old Testament narratives to rationalize their violent methods. The Army of God is most infamous for a string of arson attacks, bombings, and even assassinations targeting abortion clinics and doctors, such as the 1998 murder of Dr. Barnett Slepian and the 1997 bombing of an Atlanta clinic. They have also issued manuals and manifestos detailing how to carry out such acts, claiming they are fulfilling a higher moral and spiritual obligation. Although not as globally active as other religious terror groups, the Army of God represents a dangerous form of domestic religious extremism, driven by a radicalized interpretation of Christianity. A loosely connected ideological movement rooted in Christian identity theology, which promotes white supremacy and a radical interpretation of the Bible. Inspired by the biblical figure Phinehas from Numbers 25, adherents believe they are divinely mandated to carry out violent acts against interracial couples, abortion providers, LGBTQ+ individuals, and government institutions they view as ungodly or Zionist-controlled. They interpret Phinehas' killing of an Israelite man and a Midianite woman as divine approval for using violence to uphold racial and moral purity. Phinehas priests see themselves as warriors in a holy war against a multicultural and secular world. They operate independently, often as lone wolves, and justify domestic terrorism, including bombings, assassinations, and robberies, as acts of righteousness commanded by God. The movement gained notoriety in the 1990s after violent attacks by self-declared priests, including armed robberies and attacks on Planned Parenthood clinics. They are closely associated with other extremist ideologies like Christian identity and the anti-government militia movement. Radical reinterpretation of Christianity primarily active in the United States. At its core, the movement claims that white Europeans are the true descendants of the ancient Israelites, while Jews are portrayed as imposters, and non-white races are deemed subhuman or soulless. This deeply racist theology provides the foundation for their violent worldview, blending extremist nationalism with apocalyptic prophecy. Adherents believe they are God's chosen people and that a divine race war is inevitable, one in which they are destined to purge the world of all non-white and non-Christian influences. They justify acts of violence, such as bombings, shootings, and hate crimes, as necessary steps in fulfilling what they see as biblical mandates for racial separation and divine justice. The movement has inspired several terror attacks in the U.S., including ties to the Oklahoma City bombing and various militia groups involved in domestic terrorism. It overlaps with other hate-based groups like the Ku Klux Klan and Aryan Nations. And while not a centralized organization, its ideas have spread through sermons, literature, and underground networks.
Religious violence. Terrorism built on faith begins not with religion itself, but with fear and identity. When social unrest, poverty, or political decay collide with apocalyptic belief, extremists reinterpret sacred words to sanctify anger. Christianity, a faith that began with a teacher who told followers to love enemies, has been repeatedly reimagined by zealots as a mandate to destroy them. Every era produced its own version of this distortion, from medieval armies wearing crosses to modern militias quoting scripture on social media. What ties them together is not doctrine, but delusion, the belief that God approves hatred. The Crusades, holiness turned into conquest. Beginning in the 11th century, popes and monarchs launched campaigns to reclaim the Holy Land. They called it a pilgrimage of penance. In practice, it became centuries of warfare. Soldiers were promised forgiveness of sins if they fought for Christ. Entire towns were wiped out under banners marked with red crosses. Theological scholars later described this as the first major case of Christian terrorism. Organized violence presented as divine duty. The tragedy was not only the deaths but the precedent, the idea that killing for God could be holy. The Inquisition and fear of heresy. As medieval Europe grew, the church feared fragmentation. Heresy was treated not as error, but infection. Inquisitors hunted dissenters, believing they were protecting souls by torturing bodies. From Spain to France, thousands died in public executions framed as purification. The victims ranged from theologians to ordinary believers who questioned authority. This era reveals how institutional fear can mutate into terror. Once a system believes it speaks for God, every opponent becomes evil. Colonial violence and the civilizing mission. When European empires spread across the globe, they brought the Bible alongside rifles. Explorers baptized conquest, calling indigenous people heathens to justify enslavement and cultural erasure. Christian rhetoric of salvation cloaked centuries of exploitation in moral language. Entire tribes were forced into conversion through violence. Historians now call this spiritual imperialism, not because Christianity created it, but because human greed wore Christian symbols to make itself look righteous. Witch hunts and fear-driven faith. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, thousands of women were executed for alleged witchcraft. Fear of the devil merged with superstition, and scripture was twisted to validate torture. The witch trials were localized terror campaigns, neighbors accusing neighbors, priests blessing executions, faith becoming hysteria. It showed how theology without compassion breeds cruelty, and how fear of evil can make believers resemble the evil they fear. Civil wars and holy justifications. During Europe's religious wars, Protestant versus Catholic, both sides saw themselves as defenders of divine truth. Soldiers prayed before battles, believing victory would prove God's favor. The 30 Years' War killed millions, many civilians. Modern historians consider it one of the earliest examples of large-scale Christian-on-Christian terrorism, where ideology erased humanity. By its end, even religious leaders admitted the contradiction, Christ's followers slaughtering one another in his name. Racial terror and supremacist Christianity. In later centuries, colonial theology evolved into racial theology. Certain groups reinterpreted scripture to claim that one race was divinely chosen. In the American South, slaveholders used verses out of context to defend bondage. After slavery ended, white supremacist groups adopted Christian symbols, burning crosses, quoting scripture about purity and judgment. Their actions were terrorism disguised as piety. The cross, originally a sign of sacrificial love, was transformed into an emblem of fear.